We Made This.
Welcome back everyone to a podcast all about the sounds of cinema and discussion about them between the notes, which is where we come in. I'm Tony Black.
And I'm Sean Wilson.
And this week, in a special celebration of his work, as part of hopefully an occasional series focusing in on classic composers, we're looking at the work of the great Elmer Bernstein, who lived from 1922 to 2004 and left us with some of the most beautiful and profound scores in 20th century cinematic history. So in our previous incarnation, Sean, of Between the Notes, which is now lost to the ages, as we've said before, I think we did an episode on Elmer Bernstein. But when I said to you, given, again, as we keep saying all the time, we're still under this, waiting game for when we're going to get new films and talk potentially about newer music that's a bit more main, in the public eye. I said, let's do something about, a classic composer. Let's focus on one. And and Elmer Bernstein was the first person that leapt at you, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, because he would be on, for me, the Mount Rushmore of film music, the founding fathers of film music, however you want to say it. He would be up there with Alfred Newman, Jerry Goldsmith, Max Steiner, Bernard Herrmann, John Williams. But Elmer Bernstein was a trailblazer and a pioneer, and yet he also had a remarkable ability to come up with some of the most heartbreakingly beautiful melodies that ever heard in cinema. And I think we are coming up to the 16th anniversary of his death as we record this. It was August 18th, 2004, and I acknowledged that, and I thought, okay, what better time to champion the extraordinary legacy of one of the greatest composers ever to grace film. And it struck me actually that 2004 was rough because we lost Jerry Goldsmith in July 2004, and then we lost Elmer Bernstein about a month later. I mean, two titans. I mean, it's just it talk about closing a chapter in pop culture history. When you lose people like that, the medium is never the same again. And I think I'm really excited about the playlist that we've cooked up and what we're going to be talking about, because I think it showcases what a remarkable individual and what an extraordinary musician Elmer Bernstein was.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you say he's one of the titans there of, the first, major sort of mid 20th century era of film composing. I mean, he would have been almost 100, from where we are if he was still alive today. So I suppose, he was around, wasn't he, at the point when you had people like Steiner, Newman, and Herrmann doing their thing. But his career spanned right up to the early 2000s. Similar, I suppose, to Jerry Goldsmith. But it feels like does Elmer Bernstein go further back, or are they roughly contemporary? And I suppose, the span, because our 10 choices are quite, cover quite a good 40-year span, 50-year span. So kind of where does the story begin for Bernstein?
Well, I suppose let's start as they say at the beginning. So born in New York to a Jewish family. Interestingly, looking up his biographical information, he started as a dancer and an actor, and gravitated towards music from like late childhood onwards. Was mentored by Aaron Copland, who is considered one of the godfather of the Americana pastoral style of music. Very, very influenced by Aaron Copland. We'll hear that as we get into Bernstein's Western scores. Was drafted into the United States Army Air Forces and wrote music for the Armed Forces radio, and that militaristic influence would again come to bear on a lot of his later scores, particularly his comedy scores. And he worked his way into the film industry, where he immediately established a very, very distinct voice. You're right, he was contemporaries with the likes of Jerry Goldsmith. I mean, maybe in terms of films, he might have he predated Jerry Goldsmith by a few years. At this point in the 1950s, Jerry Goldsmith started in the first part of that decade by working on television, and then it was in the latter part of that decade that Goldsmith moved into movies, whereas Bernstein was a few years earlier and very much coming in the wake of people like Alex North and Bernard Herrmann and people like that. One of the interesting things that I learned about Bernstein was that he was blacklisted in the McCarthy communist scare of the 1950s, which I didn't know. And what that meant was that the films that he was assigned to score suddenly became worse and worse, almost as a punishment. There was a notoriously bad film that I looked up called Robot Monster, which, you know, someone of Bernstein's skills shouldn't have been going anywhere near that. But this was a direct result of being blacklisted during the McCarthy trials. He came out of that and immediately restored his reputation with scores like The Man with the Golden Arm and The Ten Commandments is two of the scores that we'll be talking about today, which are extraordinary achievements for very different reasons. And yeah, I think that what I love about Bernstein's music is that even he had a remarkable capacity for intimacy and warmth and kind of homeliness and an emotional directness. And I think a lot of people think that's easy. I think a lot of people make the mistaken assumption that to come up with a memorable melody is easy. I think it's not easy at all. To craft deceptively simple music that speaks to both the heart and the brain is very, very hard to do. And Bernstein had a real gift for that. But even in his more grandiose scores, we've selected a lot of scores that are a little more rambunctious and more sweeping. Even within those parameters, he was able to find quieter, more deeply affecting nuances. So I think he was just an incredible man. And I think that you quite correctly pointed out that the span of the scores that we've picked give an indication of the breadth of this person's career. It's really quite remarkable.
I suppose there's a real sense of like diversity in terms of the kind of things he could do, Bernstein, really. And I think we're reflecting that in the scores we're going to talk about, because he could kind of flip from jocular and fun to really sinister and intense, and then quite sweeping and beautiful and romantic. And again, and we've talked about this before with other composers, the best composers always have that definitive style about them. There's something in even something as diverse as Airplane compared to Far From Heaven, say. There's always something in there where you go, that's Elmer Bernstein, like you would with John Williams or like you would with Jerry Goldsmith. And that is always a signifier of a composer who just breaks through and manages to put their own stamp on film music, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. To go back to the earlier word, I think there was a sense of intimacy in Bernstein's music. I think that I point towards acquaintance of ours, James Southall, who runs moviewave.net, which is one of the best online archives of film music reviews ever. I'd encourage anyone to go and check out James's work. But he makes the astute observation that Bernstein was often at his best when working with a chamber-sized orchestra, with a relatively small, scaled-down orchestra, and the amount of emotion that Bernstein was able to wring out of a small orchestra as opposed to a full symphony was really quite something. And obviously Bernstein could work in the larger symphonic realm, of course, and he did that many, many times throughout his career. But when you think of scores like To Kill a Mockingbird or Far From Heaven, as you just mentioned, the way that despite this is relatively limited acoustics and harmonics, given that he's working with a chamber orchestra as opposed to a bigger full symphony, the amount of emotion that he's able to wring from a melody is it's a gift. It's a real gift. Bernstein was one of the finest melodists that film music has ever known. And I think that because that gift was so strong, like you say, it cuts through and you can recognise one of his works pretty much immediately. And
we were lucky enough, weren't we, a few years ago to go and see some of this stuff live. And I've seen, we were talking about it, and I said, well, when was this? Was it 3? Was it 4 years ago? And I've since looked it up and found out that it was on June the 18th, 2017. So it was 3 years ago, just over 3 years ago from when we record. And I'll never forget, because it was a Friday night. And I'll remember, because I think I met you there, didn't I? I remember, because the Royal Albert Hall have in the past been kind enough to give us press tickets for this, for shows, which is very, very good of them. So I remember I was at work till like 3 in the afternoon, and I immediately left work, jumped in a cab, went straight to the train station, got a train to London, and it was a beautiful day. It was a beautiful evening. And I just got there because the train was like taking a while, and it started at something like, doors were opening at like 6:30. And I was like, am I going to do this? Am I going to get there? And when I got there, even better, I got there on time, and I was given a better seat than the one that was on the ticket when I got in. So I got into like the good bit of stalls, I think, because I don't think we were sitting together for that one. I think we met up around it, but I don't think for that one we were actually sat together.
I think we were, because I remember we were. I went with my parents because the Elmer Bernstein scored a lot of music for films with which my dad was familiar. My dad wanted to see it, particularly The Magnificent Seven. Which we'll talk about, but we were upgraded to a box seat.
Yes,
you came and sat next to us.
I did, but that was the second half, because in the first half when I got there, I was on the main ground floor bit, and it was a really good view of the stage. And then I found you in the midway, and you were like, "Yeah, I'm in a box." I was like, "How?"
I mean, full credit to the Royal Albert Hall. They upgraded us for free, and then there was enough room in the box for you to come and join us, and we had an unparalleled view of the orchestra. And also of the compere, John Landis, who collaborated many times with Bernstein, and he was there delivering anecdotes in between every performance. That was a wonderful evening. It was really remarkable.
And I'd forgotten as well, but Elmer Bernstein's son, Peter Bernstein, was also there as well with John Landis doing bits. I don't know if you remember this, but he came on as well. I've since found out, while I was doing some Googling, I did a review for Flickering Myth around the time of that event, and it's actually on Peter Bernstein's website.
Nice.
I've just found this. Like, this is like 3 years ago. It was a 5-star review saying how great it was, because there were some brilliant things on there. Some of the things we're going to talk about today, but there was the Ten Commandments, there was The Great Escape, The Magnificent Seven, The Man with the Golden Arm, but there was also stuff like The Age of Innocence and Three Amigos as well. And An American Werewolf in London, things that Landis was introducing. So it was a really good mix of music. It was lovely. It was a special, and I hadn't actually heard all of that music completely in the way that it was presented there. So I would say, if anyone does get the chance to see any kind of Elmer Bernstein music on a live venue, then yeah, definitely go and do it.
Well, it was an incredibly profound evening, because I remember my dad started to cry with some of the performances that they were doing, because the music drew associations of the films so vividly. I think there's something about seeing a symphony orchestra playing recognisable film themes in front of you. It's one of the most powerful things that anyone can experience, particularly if it's music from a film that with which you've identified since a child. That's incredibly profoundly emotional experience, and I think it's testament to how brilliant Elmer Bernstein was, that even after his death, his music can extend that and can have that kind of impact.
So yeah, we've chosen 5 scores each as per our normal system right now, and we'll have a Spotify playlist that will be up that has most of this music on, with maybe 1 or 2 little additions from YouTube. But I think we've got a nice varied mixture of scores to discuss here, and hopefully you'll be able to go and listen to. And just before we talk about them, just remember, please, if you're enjoying the show, do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts with a little rating as well, so more people can hear us talk about Elmer Bernstein and all the other stuff we discuss. But yeah, your first choice, Sean, is one of, I think, Bernstein's most beautiful and classic scores. You've gone for To Kill a Mockingbird, the classic 1962 drama based on Harper Lee's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, starring Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch, the lawyer. And it's a classic film from the 1960s, and I mean, it is just, the score is just sumptuous.
I'd put this in the 10 greatest scores of all time easily.
Wow, really?
Yeah, I'd definitely put it up there. And I think what it demonstrates is as I mentioned earlier, the power of emotional directness. The fact that a composer doesn't need to dress up the subject matter with florid, ostentatious orchestration or themes. What they need to do, as Jerry Goldsmith repeatedly said, is discover what the emotional heart of the film is and mould the music around that. And Bernstein did that magnificently in To Kill a Mockingbird, because what he realised after an initial struggle with the music, what he realised was that, as per the book, the story is told through the eyes of young Scout, Atticus's daughter, and it's a story of two children awakening to the sense of a world that is deeply unfair and yet is also deeply compassionate at the same time, as represented by the tremendous Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch. So when Bernstein unlocked that, what you get is one of the most gorgeously lyrical and wistful scores ever. That is almost like, it's almost like music that's been filtered through a memory, with the emphasis on the piano and the woodwind and the strings. And there's a little harmonica influence as well, just to give it a bit of deep South influence, because obviously the story is set in Alabama, I believe. But that's done very subtly, and it must have been a very, very hard film to score, because the music decidedly cannot be melodramatic, because it would swamp the film and it would overtake the story. And I think that Bernstein and director Robert Mulligan do a tremendous job in, as we've mentioned before, spotting the movie and locating where the music is meant to be used for maximum impact. And the relative discretion of the score is what helps make it so powerful. And despite the fact that I've said that it's got one of the most beautiful themes ever, there are moments of darkness in the score as well. There is the character of the racist Bob Ewell, who is a vile character, and that character makes his presence felt as the narrative proceeds, and the score gets darker and slightly angrier as the two kids, Jem and Scout Atticus's kids, become aware of this character. But then there is that redemptive, just stunningly beautiful final movement at the end, where you get the narration from Scout and the camera pulls away from the window up into the sky, and you've got Bernstein's strings just soaring along with it. It's a breathtaking score, and it was Oscar nominated in 1962. It didn't win. It lost it to Lawrence Arabia, Maurice Jarre. I have to be honest, Lawrence Arabia is one of the most towering achievements in film history, and Maurice Jarre's score is spectacular. I have to say, I would much rather that the intimacy and the kind of understated beauty of To Kill a Mockingbird had got it that year. I have to be honest. I mean, I think there is the assumption that just because a score is bigger, that makes it more worthy. I think in this instance, I would say no.
I mean, I suppose it is one of those examples, though, where we've had plenty of them on this podcast, haven't we, where we go, how did that win? How did that possibly win against, Alien or whatever? And we're like, well, in this case, much as, I think I do agree with you. You can't begrudge Lawrence of Arabia in a way. It's like, well, I mean, it's pretty great. Yeah. So we can forgive that one, but it's not too much of a crime. But yeah, I think you're right. And it was re-recorded, this, wasn't it? It was re-recorded in the 70s. Bernstein re-recorded the score, and then he recorded it in 96 with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra for a Varese Sarabande release. So he re-recorded it a few times, the last being just a few years before his death. But yeah, I mean, it is beautiful, absolutely. It really is beautiful. Like it is one of those scores that just, I think you put it brilliantly there when you said it's like filtered through like a dream, because that you do really get that hazy sense about it while being really profound and powerful. It's just gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous.
I suppose the other thing I want to mention as well is on the original recording, the piano performance that you hear was undertaken by none less than John Williams. The John Williams.
Wow, okay.
Because he was a session pianist, and it was funny, we mentioned contemporaries of various composers earlier. At the time that Elmer Bernstein had got himself established in Hollywood through the 1950s and 60s, John Williams hadn't yet got himself to the stage of fully fledged Oscar-winning composer. So he was a session pianist on other people's scores. I believe the Pink Panther as well he might have performed the piano on the Pink Panther for Henry Mancini, but it's definitely him on To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a little bit of trivia there, fans.
Yeah, a little bit of a sign of what's to come, really, because he's like about 10 years younger than Bernstein, isn't he, John Williams? So yeah, it's just the next sort of era of film composers. So yeah, fantastic. So for my first choice, I've gone for another very well-known score to a very well-known film, because as it always works, Sean, quite often you will pick out, some hidden gems as well as some really good ones. And I always go for the big splashy, everyone knows this kind of stuff.
But in the case of Bernstein, you need those. You need those. Everyone knows this ones, because believe me, it was really difficult for me to whittle down this list. And when I made my selection, I left out some really famous ones, and I was hoping that you would pick up the slack and include them, and you did.
Oh well, that's
so
all right.
I'm really grateful for that.
So, yeah. Well, on that basis, then I've gone for The Great Escape, which everybody knows. Everyone knows 1963. War film, Steve McQueen, a whole host of names, James Garner, Richard Attenborough, Charles Bronson, Donald Pleasance.
While you're relaying about the film, shall I just do that underneath?
Just do it, yeah. Dun, 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 dun. But this is it, right? This film has got one of those tunes, one of those themes that, like we've talked about before, for things like a lot of John Williams, actually, things like Superman or Jaws or whatever, it is instantly known. Like, everybody knows the theme to The Great Escape. I mean, it's been particularly popularised, actually, in football culture, because especially when you get England games, you get them whistling or singing or humming The Great Escape en masse, in football stadiums. And that's been the case for decades now. So not everyone in that football stadium is going to know where this is from necessarily, but I still would venture that a lot of people have seen The Great Escape, because it's constantly on television. Like, it should have its own channel, The Great Escape.
It should.
I don't think there's a week that goes by where it's not on telly in the UK. I mean, it's just on constant repeat, because I suppose it's a famous story. Steve McQueen leads a band of rebels in the war to escape a German POW camp, and I think it's one of those films that has kind of gone beyond its quality, like, in a way, because it's a decent film. It's pretty good, but I don't think it's fantastic. But I think everyone would remember maybe The Great Escape being slightly better than it is for things like, the classic Steve McQueen on the bike and all this kind of thing. But there's no getting away from the fact the music is fab. It's Elmer Bernstein tuned into a different side of what he can do, something much more raising and playful, because that's the other thing that comes out in some of these scores we're talking about today. Actually, there is a really sort of playful nature to Bernstein at the same time.
Yeah, there is, and I think that what was I saying earlier about the ability to craft a melody that people the world over can remember? That's a remarkable skill. For a piece of film music to translate into a football crowd is astonishing. That never happens, and I think what it shows is that the nature of the melody clearly works so brilliantly in embodying what the spirit of the film is, which is obviously that's the core of what film music needs to do. And I think that what Bernstein does in this score is that, despite the fact that the parameters of the film are quite wide, it's set during World War II, you've got various people from the across the Allied divide working together within this one camp. So the parameters of the story are quite broad, and yet the score doesn't necessarily play up the militaristic, gloomy aspects of the war. What it does is, as I said before, it's got an intimate, whimsical feel to it in the way that Bernstein often does. It is right, it's playful, and I think what the score does is it plays up that underdog spirit of the characters brilliantly. It doesn't It's not a score that's necessarily interested in the instrumental heroic conventions of what happens, although that does play more of a part towards the end of the score as we get the scenes with Steve McQueen on the bike where the brass section comes more to the forefront. For the most part, what the score is doing is it's got a kind of darting, light sense of movement and whimsy, and it's about giving inner voice to these seemingly unflappable characters who, despite their outer reserve, are clearly so determined to get one up on the Nazis. And I think that clearly Bernstein did that so tremendously well that people have subsequently recognised that in the years since, hence why it's been adopted in football matches and so on and so forth. And there is a bit of militaristic, like snare drums and so on, but it's remarkable how little that is actually in the score. Only maybe in the final quarter, in the final third of it. And I think in terms of a score it's very cheerful for the most part. It's a very cheerful score, and you wouldn't think, looking at the subject matter, that it would call for a cheerful score. But I think what it does is it creates a real sense of escapist empathy with the characters, and it's a very, very difficult thing to pull off. I don't know if any other composer other than Bernstein would have managed it, because I think what you run the risk of maybe patronising the subject matter or undermining the dramatic integrity of the movie. Bernstein was so good working with John Sturges, the director, that he doesn't do that. His dramatic instincts were, incredible.
I suppose it works in the sense that the film itself is escapist. It is all about these plucky band of heroes getting out of the war camp. So I think he provided a score that fits that heroic, fun tone that they were going for in many ways. Just as a little bit of an extra about the football stuff, that the particularly The Great Escape has been played by who used to be known as the Pucker Pies England Band.
Is there anything more English than that?
Well, exactly. Because they're a brass band that started in 1996, and they were sponsored by Pucker Pies from 2006 until 2014. They started performing at England games in 1996, at which point the manager of the team at that time, Terry Venables, was one of the people who heard them playing for Sheffield Wednesday away fans at Arsenal in London. And he said, come and play in Euro 96, which was, one of the big cultural events of the 90s, really, in the UK. It was a real moment, actually, the Euro 96. I remember it quite vividly, and that was the first time they started to play on like these drums and this brass instrumentation, the Great Escape theme. And then it's passed through, and subsequently was they recorded a theme tune based on the Great Escape for the 98 World Cup, and then another one in Euro 2000, and it's still going today, even though they come under a lot of criticism, apparently, from other fans who are fed up of them, basically. And I think there's a bit of a reactionary thing to it being a little bit too patriotic and nationalist these days, which is, a fair. I mean, that football's full of that stuff, so it's a fair thing. But it just shows how this has a piece of music, particularly the theme, because that's kind of what they play. They don't obviously play the whole score, but it's just the theme. It's the dun 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 dun, dun, and it's become to represent in the UK a sense of nationalism, actually, for better or worse. So it's just amazing how a piece of film music breaks through and can reflect that mood.
Yeah, and it's only select pieces of film music do that. You think of a lot of the works of John Williams or Hans Zimmer. If for a piece of film music to do that, to break out into a mass audience who might not necessarily be fond of classical music, is remarkable. I mean, I don't know if you've watched the Eddie Izzard stand-up act of Dressed to Kill, where he does an extended thing about the Great Escape, and it's brilliant. It's really funny. And when he talks about how Steve McQueen's out there on the bike, he's out, and then the music's going ba 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 ba, and meanwhile all the British are going, can't we do a motorbike? Damn! So he plays up the coolness of Steve McQueen versus the uptightness of the British, and he's like, so meanwhile all the British are there in trilbies, sort of overcoats, top hats, briefcases. Meanwhile, Steve's there in jeans headphones and a t-shirt, disguised as an American man. Which,
yeah, it says it all.
Yeah, and I think to go back to what you said earlier about The Great Escape being escapist, yeah, you're absolutely right, and the music plays that up just wonderfully.
Yeah, it does, and it's a lot of fun, even if it's not necessarily the best film that we're talking about on this list, or really Bernstein's peak, but it's definitely one of his most memorable. So yeah, it's very, very good. And a very interesting choice is your second one, which is a film that I'd forgotten actually, because this was played at the Bernstein concert, but I'd admittedly forgotten this piece of music, which is surprising because I think this was great. From The Man with the Golden Arm from 1955, which is a American drama directed by Otto Preminger, one of the great classic film directors of that era, based on a novel of the same name, starring Frank Sinatra, Kim Novak, Darren McGavin, amongst other people. And I think it was very well fated at the time, but I don't know if this is a film necessarily that is passed down outside of cinema fans particularly. It's from the 50s, but the score is really quite something. It's quite surprising almost. It's actually quite jazzy, and it's quite upbeat and stylish in a very different way than you hear from a lot of other Bernstein scores.
Yeah, it's one of the pioneering jazz scores from this period in Hollywood. That's why I chose it, because jazz is generally accepted to have arrived in Hollywood film music with Alex North's A Streetcar Named Desire, which I believe was released in 1951. So this came a few years after it. So this is very much Bernstein picking up the mantle of what Alex North had done. A Streetcar Named Desire, Like to Kill a Mockingbird, would be one of those top 10 greatest film scores ever, in my opinion. Yeah, I think that The Man with the Golden Arm is brilliant. It's just, I was listening to it in full again the other night, and it might seem a bit glib to say it, but it's just the definition of badass. It's just so swaggering, and it's got such a sense of style about it. And it's really punchy and really energetic. And for those people who are interested, there was another, Elmer Bernstein did several jazz scores. Another one is The Sweet Smell of Success for the Burt Lancaster, Tony Curtis film, which is another really terrific jazz score. But yeah, there was very much, at the point that Bernstein composed this, the idea of jazz as applied to film music was still a relatively novel concept. And I suppose one could also point to the likes of Bernard Herrmann, The Trouble with Harry, things like that, which was composed around the same time. It's the use of jazz as a dramatic narrative device to illustrate what is going on with the Frank Sinatra character is terrific. It's got a kind of seediness and a sleaziness to it, yet it's also got a kind of rebellious swagger to it. There is also a classic sort of early to mid Hollywood era counterpoint. The feminine theme for Kim Novak's character Molly is very much done on these kind of tender, like wavering strings, which I suppose in this day and age, if one were to compose for a female character like that, it might come in for some form of criticism. It's like, well, that's a bit, and that might be a bit glib and it might be a bit stereotypical. But in the context of this score, it offsets the trumpets and the saxophones and the trombones just brilliantly. And some of the pieces have just such a rocking sense of energy to them. I mean, I suppose if one wants to check out the main theme, the track is Frankie Machine, which is the name of Frank Sinatra's character. It's really something. It's really, really great. And it was nominated for an Oscar, didn't win. Bernstein only got one Oscar throughout his career, which was for Thoroughly Modern Millie in 1967, which is a score that neither of us have chosen. But again, like Jerry Goldsmith, think one Oscar in this career is remarkable. The amount of times that Bernstein was shafted for Oscar in terms of Oscars is appalling, really.
Yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it? Like, I suppose what surprises me with this score is that, and I haven't seen the film, admittedly, but the description of the film is that it's quite dark. It's a drug addict getting clean in prison, having difficulty staying that way when he's out. dealing with drug addiction at a point when, you know, cinema wasn't really doing that. You know, it was quite controversial. Yet the score could have been from a spy thriller. You know, it could have been from a plonky, you know, weirdly, do you know what it reminded me of? And maybe this was definitely inspired by The Man with the Golden Arm, not the other way around, obviously. But do you remember the film, the 97 sort of pastiche of The Man Who Knew Too Much, The Man Who Knew Too Little, with Bill Murray?
Bill Murray, yeah, I do, yeah. Christopher Young did the score for that.
Christopher Young did the score for that. Now, I quite like the film, to be fair, but, you know, it's not a great of cinema, but the score is really good, actually. The Christopher Young score is really good. I don't know why, but I immediately thought about that score when I was listening to this. And even though they're not the same as such, but it's just that style. Even The Man with the Golden Arm, it sounds like it could be a Bond movie. You know,
it does.
It's strange.
I think there's something about jazz. There's something about maybe the improvisational quality and the instrumental quality of jazz that speaks of many, many different things. I mean, when I hear it in the context of Man with the Golden Arm, that's really interesting to say that it could be it could come from a spy thriller. Yeah, I do agree. I mean, for me, what it signifies is the birth of the modern American city. It's bustling, it's dirty, there's lots of corruption, there's lots of, you know, low-life characters, and it's perfectly aligned to the film, because as you quite rightly said, the film was very controversial at the time. The idea of dealing so openly with drug addiction and manipulative characters, it was very dark for its time. Otto Preminger, the director, was famous for that, for dealing with these complicated subjects. But yeah, it's fascinating that jazz is a very, very contradictory medium, and when you apply it to film, I think it becomes almost more contradictory, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it can sort of go in different directions, but it was fascinating. Yeah, and really great piece of music. So I'm really glad you introduced me to this score properly through this. I've gone for, with my choice, maybe this is a slight cheat, because my second choice is the score to Cape Fear, but the 1991 remake by Martin Scorsese, starring Robert De Niro playing, you know. I had to try and squeeze an impression in there somewhere, even if it's fairly out of context.
Shall I offset it with a? Oh, so I'm Al Pacino. What?
It's got to be done. Yeah, let's just talk about Heat for the next hour.
Yeah. Should we just do the coffee shop thing? Brother, you are going down.
You know what? I can't. Yeah, okay, we'll stop. But yeah, Cape Fear 91. And obviously the original Cape Fear was scored by Bernard Herrmann. And from what I understand, Scorsese essentially wanted Elmer Bernstein to sort of port in that Herrmann-esque style for 91's Cape Fear, even if it's a slightly different take on the same material. So, I mean, I think it's brilliant. You know, I think it's a fantastic thriller score, really terrifying at points. One of the pieces of music that Bernstein, it's different. Again, it's quite different from a lot of the other things on this list. But I mean, what do you think the thought process there with Scorsese was in terms of wanting to evoke Herrmann's music and you know, similar themes and that kind of thing through Bernstein, who would have been a Herrmann contemporary, as we've said?
Yeah, it's interesting it's a really interesting choice, this, because Bernstein and Herrmann were breaking down boundaries at the same point in Hollywood in the 1950s and 1960s, and because Martin Scorsese has got such an encyclopedic knowledge of all cinema, I imagine that he would have had his pick of composers, and he thought, well, given that Bernard Herrmann died in 1976, so therefore he can't score my 1991 remake of Cape Fear, what other composers would have been contemporaneous around the time that Bernard Herrmann did the original Cape Fear score in 1962? I mean, one of the very few would probably have been Jerry Goldsmith, but I imagine it was probably just a process of elimination. He probably thought, well, in the year that the original Cape Fear came out, Elmer Bernstein was breaking down boundaries, albeit with very different films like To Kill a Mockingbird. So I imagine it might have just been a logical process of lining up the original Bernard Herrmann score with Elmer Bernstein's own imperatives. But also, I think because Martin Scorsese is not just a director, he is also an archivist and a historian, and what he did in the 91 Cape Fear movie is he crafted a modern day movie that deliberately owes a sense of style to the kind of overcooked 1950s, 1960s approach with, crash zooms and strange transitions and a generally kind of burbling, overwrought sense of menace, to the extent that it almost becomes blackly comic. But that is kind of deliberate. It's very much the 1991 Cape Fear. The tone of it very much is not necessarily in keeping with what you would expect from a 1990s thriller. It's got a very kind of retro, again, slightly hysterical tone to it. Although I think it is interesting that the original Cape Fear, the Gregory Peck, Robert Mitchum one, is relatively subdued. But maybe Scorsese was aping a different kind of general 50s, 60s philosophy with his visual language. And I think he recognised that the score was crucial to that. By selecting Bernard Herrmann's score and by getting Elmer Bernstein to adapt it, it creates a kind of genetic connection with the past, which is always so important to Scorsese. The idea of legacy and heritage is so important to him as a filmmaker, because obviously he's an advocate for the preservation of celluloid and so on and so forth. So I think whenever Scorsese can hark back like that, he will do it. And one of the ways he recognised it on this project was through the music. And Bernard Herrmann's theme for Cape Fear is so menacing. I mean, the 4-note trombone theme is just one of the most famously terrifying things. And the way that Bernstein dresses it up with rearranges it, introduces more wavering woodwind instruments and sort of tremolo strings, which have a kind of watery ambience to it, which is obviously entirely appropriate given where the story ends up. Yeah, it's not one that I would have picked, but there is a kind of synthesis between two composers who burst into Hollywood at roughly the same moment, and then one died in 1976. Then you have the other one picking up the mantle in 1991. Interesting choice.
Yeah, and I suppose my question to you would be, what's the better film? Which one, 62 or 91?
I mean, the 62 one is more contained and more reserved and maybe scarier. I think the 1991 film is, again, it's got a different register to it. It pushes it so over the top by intention that it does almost become a black comedy. But what Scorsese also does is he teases out the themes that they weren't allowed to make explicit in the 1960s version. So the 90s version is much more violent, much more upfront, but it's also about the that very perverse relationship that Robert De Niro as Max Cady has with the Juliette Lewis character, with the daughter, which is the most, that's the creepiest and most menacing stuff in the entire movie. But Robert De Niro just basically plays it like a boogeyman, doesn't he? He plays it like a towering counselor, come out wherever you are, like that. And it's horrible. It's horrible. But he almost becomes like an anti-hero, which Robert Mitchum decidedly was not that in the 61. So it's different imperatives, and I think the Bernstein adapting the Herrmann score makes the thing more overcranked and overcooked, but I think that's definitely what they were going for.
I think 91 by a shade, to be fair, because Scorsese's direction I think is better than in the first film, really, even though the first film's got some great stuff. But yeah, fantastic scores both, and it was just really interesting to have a run at that. And now for something completely different, for your third choice, which is a little-known film. And what's it called, Sean?
Well, it's called Airplane.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley. You can't not do it, can you?
I had to do it. I was like, come on, we got to do it. Yeah.
My favourite bit is later on when they reprise it. And he goes, we're running out of time, Mr. Stryker. Surely there must be something you can do. And he's walking away. I'm doing everything I can. And stop calling me Shirley.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much in this. Obviously, this is the 1980 film from the Zucker brothers and Jim Abrahams, which is probably the most beloved and well-known cinematic spoof in American cinema history. I think Airplane. I think if you had a list of films, I think Airplane would be number one. I mean, it's not my personal favourite. It's up there. My personal favourite is the first Naked Gun of this style, which is obviously the Zucker brothers again. But this is this is legendary. And it's one of those films where, because you remember the gags, because you remember the lines like we've just done, because you remember the whole setup, which is a spoof of the big sort of 1970s disaster, well, even going back to the 50s actually, disaster movies. You forget the music, oddly enough. Yet the music from Bernstein plays a very important part in why this film works, doesn't it?
Yeah, it makes it funnier. It's one of those classic that it's often said that you can score a comedy in two very distinct ways. You can make the music silly and reflect the inherent silliness of the concept, or you can make the music dead serious. But in this instance, Bernstein goes for the latter, and the way that amplifies the humour is really quite remarkable. There's a wonderful interview that I looked at with Zucker and Abrams where they said that they went to Bernstein and he got the principle of the thing straight away. He understood exactly that the music needed to be scored in a dead, straight-faced, deadpan manner, as if he was scoring a kind of overcranked disaster movie. But they told him, like, don't do a sophisticated suspense score, do it corny, do it overblown, but serious. And apparently there was in this interview, I think it's with Entertainment Weekly, they said he laughed through every when he had to, well, obviously film composers have to watch films repeatedly in order to be able to spot them and time the music, and apparently he laughed through every single screening of it and he understood exactly what it was. And it's really quite remarkable. The music, it makes the film even more hysterically funny than it is, but when you listen to the music away from the film, as I did recently, it actually works as a dramatic underscore really well, which is, I don't quite know how Bernstein pulled that off, because I think, again, as we've said, he was a great thematic writer and he was a great melodist. Even when being completely riotously silly like this, he was able to conjure really listenable, wonderful music that is composed of very distinct constructs, very distinct themes. And but that said, I mean, within it, there are, I mean, the classic opening scene, like when he lifts John Williams' Jaws theme as the airplane's fin comes through the clouds. But the use of the militaristic snare drums, the low brass, the xylophones, which so perfectly meshes with the deadpan reactions of Leslie Nielsen, Peter Graves, Robert Stack, and so on, because the whole idea was that Zucker said that these guys, when they were at their peak, were funnier than most comedians of the day. And the genius of the film was you take those guys from those disaster movies, you put them in a disaster movie spoof, and by having them play it serious, it becomes even funnier, and it works. The trick works. And then you put Bernstein's score underneath it, which gives it this almost like pompousness, this kind of pompous, overblown. I mean, I'd put this up there as possibly the funniest film ever made. I mean, it's definitely in my top 5. It's just it's a masterclass in comic timing. Like every single performer is on fire, and there are so many jokes going on within the course of each scene. And what's the scene where it's with Leslie Nielsen and Peter Graves? He goes, "Captain, how soon can you land?" "I can't tell." "Well, you can tell me, I'm a doctor." "No, I mean, I'm just not sure." He goes, well, can you take a guess?" "Well, not for another 2 hours." You can't take a guess for another 2 hours." "No, I mean, you just can't land for another 2 hours."
It's just brilliant, isn't it? It's taking dialogue that it's taking dialogue that would have been written for previous films, but just turning the dial just a little bit to the side, and it just becomes hilarious because it just becomes really nonsensical and pun based and daft. And it is great. I mean, they had the deadpan is joyous, and I think that's the thing with the music. Good music for comedy, and I suspect we'll do an episode about comedy scores one day, because I think there's more to get into with this. But I think good music for comedy is all about underscoring, for these kind of films, that sense of deadpan, straight-faced, seriousness where the humour comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the antithesis to that would be something like Jerry Goldsmith Gremlins, which had that synth-based Gremlins march, which is deliberately very, very silly and very anarchic, yet that works. So I suppose that would be the antithesis to what Elmer Bernstein did with Airplane. I suppose, Airplane was astonishingly successful, and a large portion of that is surely down to the music, the way the music amplifies the laughs. And what it did was it initiated a bizarre move by Bernstein into comedy movies, which lasted pretty much all the way throughout the 80s. You think of Stripes, Ghostbusters, Three Amigos that you mentioned earlier. All of that largely came from Airplane. And that shows how brilliantly moulded his score was to this particular movie. The fact that he got it instinctively, he knew exactly how to make the movie funnier. And I mean, but just the love theme, like the wavering, deliberately sappy, like overblown love theme between Ted and Elaine, the two main characters who are the ones who ultimately end up having to fly the plane. Like there's that scene where they take the mickey out of From Here to Eternity when they're smooching on the beach, and you've got the love theme crashes over them just as the waves do, and then Ted says, "Oh, I've got to go on this, top secret." American Air Force mission. We're coming in from the north under their radar. And then she goes, when will you be back? And then he goes, I can't tell you that, it's classified. He's just giving her all the other information. It's so
brilliant.
The way the music draws that out, the way the music draws out the absurdity by playing it so straight, easily makes this one of the best comedy scores of all time. Easily,
I would agree with that. Definitely, it's great. Switching it up again, we're going back in time a little bit further to again one of the earlier pieces of work that he did, and probably one of the most famous Bernstein scores again for the Ten Commandments, the Cecil B. DeMille film from the 50s, one of the signature films from the 50s, probably the most well-known biblical epic of that era that they were doing all the time, starring Charlton Heston as Moses. And I think it's a classic movie. It's a long movie. It's a typical sort of Hollywood epic that these days would be prone to elements of spoof and that kind of thing. But I think this score is pretty fantastic, isn't it? And it's Bernstein at a level where he really is digging into grand orchestral biblical themes in a very different way from the more, like we say, understated or romantic and quiet, intimate sense of something like To Kill a Mockingbird. This feels like Bernstein at his biggest and grandest.
Yeah, definitely. And yet even within that, there is that signature directness. There is a tone that is very hard to put your finger on why it is that it's so singularly Bernstein. Yet even within the soaring parameters of a biblical film score, you can recognise that it's him. And this was, as you said, early in his career. There's an interesting backstory to this that I was looking into to this score. Once again, anyone who is vaguely interested in the music that we're talking about, I've mentioned moviewave.net. I would also recommend moviemusicuk.us, which is run by John Broxton. There's a review of the Ten Commandments by Craig Lacey, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced the name, which is really exhaustive and a really, really good review. I'd encourage people to go and check that out. And apparently DeMille hadn't actually chosen Elmer Bernstein. He'd chosen Victor Young to actually write the score. Bernstein was originally brought on to compose the dance sequences and chants that we see played out within the context of the film itself. Victor Young was then taken ill, and Bernstein took up the mantle of writing the entire score, both the diegetic and the non-diegetic music, and it's probably the score that announced him in Hollywood as a result. I mean, the main theme is there are many themes in the score. It's anchored by that divinity theme which is introduced in the overture at the beginning, which is very, very beautiful, and you do genuinely get a sense through the music that you are being brought close to something that is genuinely divine and awe-inspiring, and the way that it does it through the strings and the brass is really quite remarkable. There's a quote from Bernstein from this review on moviemusicuk.us that I've got to read out from Bernstein, where he says, "I hope to continue to grow as a musician, but at this moment I cannot even dream of ever again obtaining as important and challenging an assignment as composing the music for the Ten Commandments." So he clearly recognised the expectation that was on him as a relatively young composer at that point, and he succeeded admirably. The use of the various instruments like the cymbals and the ram's horn. There's the use of a ram's horn to commence the start of the Exodus. So the idea is there is a calling on the part of Charlton Heston's Moses. Little nuances like that. There's the use of a theremin during the plague sequence, which gives this woozy sci-fi atmosphere that was very, very much in vogue, the genres in Hollywood at the time. But the I watched the Red Sea sequence again. Actually, that scene is still jaw-dropping, even now.
Yeah.
The special effects are really well done, and a lot of it is down. It's Bernstein's music that makes you feel it. The scene is very technically very impressive, but it's the music that makes you feel the emotional impact of it, and the way the music becomes unashamedly heroic and propulsive towards the end. There is an Egyptian march which is more ominous. That's for Yul Brynner as the pharaoh, but the score unashamedly plays up the valor and the heroism of Moses. It's interesting, actually. I was listening to it thinking I can hear the genesis of the rhythms and the choices in the later Lights of the Magnificent Seven. I don't know if you thought that as well.
Yeah, actually, yeah.
Did you get that as well?
I think there's definitely some in there, and I mean that's only like 5 years later, isn't it? 4 years later, so he can build on the Ten Commandments. But it's amazing to think that this so early on, and he went on to do some brilliant stuff, as we know. It's amazing to think this. That quite almost makes it sound like he thinks this is it. This is the apex. They'll never be able to better this.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, but I mean, it must show that when a relatively young composer has this kind of burden thrust on them, it's like, blimey, I'm doing a Cecil B. DeMille picture. I've just barely broken into Hollywood. I've been blacklisted through the McCarthy era. I've done a couple of jazz scores. Now I have to do a biblical epic, which is the kind of most grandiose, overwhelming genre. How do I do it? And apparently I looked up, the recording sessions were spread out over 18 months, so there was no expense spared on this score, either in terms of how it was recorded or in the scope of the instrumentation. It's a really rousingly beautiful piece of work.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. So for your next one, your penultimate one, you went for a film that I'd only vaguely sort of heard of before, and he's probably one of the least well-known films, I would venture, on this list. So you've gone for Heavy Metal from 1981, a Canadian animated sci-fi fantasy film produced by Ivan Reitman, and it's got a range of names involved in terms of people who did voices for this. John Candy, Eugene Levy, Harold Ramis. Lots and lots of people. And it's an anthology of stories from Heavy Metal magazine. Very adult-based, lots of violence, sexuality, nudity. This is a strange choice for Elmer Bernstein when you compare it to a lot of the other things we've talked about. And I mean, listening to it, I've not seen the film, but listening to it, I felt like this feels like the closest he's come in this 10 list anyway that we've got to doing something of a fantasy nature, of actually tapping into that style of genre that maybe, and I might be wrong about this because you know a bit more about him than me, maybe he didn't go into that much. This feels different to a lot of his other work.
Yeah, I suppose one doesn't really think of Bernstein in terms of fantasy, but he did also do the score for the Black Cauldron, the Disney film, a few years later. So he did occasionally dabble in that,
and he did Ghostbusters, didn't he? So
yeah,
which is again similar. Yeah,
and there is a theme from Heavy Metal, which is one of the most beautiful themes that he ever conjured, which is Tana's theme. Which, when you listen to the ghostly Zool theme from Ghostbusters, that is quite clearly a reworked version of Tana's theme, and I can only imagine that he did that because Heavy Metal probably didn't get the exposure that it did, and maybe he was so proud of what he'd come up with for Heavy Metal, he thought, right, well, I can just adopt that music a little bit and put it in this Ghostbusters movie that presumably is going to reach out to a wider audience, which it did. I don't know. I'm speculating on that. Either way, the Tana theme is one of many highlights in this score, which is spectacular. I mean, this score, I would describe it as Elmer Bernstein doing Jerry Goldsmith. It's kind of...
Yeah. I see what you mean there.
It's really sumptuous, isn't it? It's really big. It's got a real resonance to it in the sweepingly beautiful themes, in the action sequences. You can really feel the might of the orchestra. There are jazzy noirish interludes which refer back to the likes of The Man with the Golden Arm. I've not seen the film. I have to say I haven't seen the film either, but I think that the score is so strong that it acts as a narrative symphony on its own terms, and I think it's a shame the film isn't more well known, because you've got Bernstein soaring to these fantastical heights that show that he could do it as well as Jerry Goldsmith or John Williams or James Horner or whoever. And it's a really diverse score, yet it's all the thematic base is very strong. It's all held together, and it all culminates in the theme for Tana, which is just breathtaking. And it's interesting that apparently it was the first score on which Bernstein used what was to become his signature instrument, which is the onde martineau, which is a variation of the theremin, which has got this ghostly, woozy sci-fi sound. It sounds like a theremin, but it's not quite a theremin. And he pretty much incorporated that into most, if not all, of his scores after that. Occasionally to his detriment, because a lot of people got a little bit fed up of it. It's kind of like, right, okay, there's no need to have that in this particular score. He used it a lot in Ghostbusters, that wavering, sort of dislocated sound. In the context of this, of heavy metal, it works, because you're dealing with something that is decidedly fantastical and strange. Yeah, this score is a masterpiece. And I think it's probably one of those examples where the score deserves to be reclaimed from the reputation of the film itself, maybe.
Yeah. I think so. It feels like it could be a Bernstein score that gets lost, definitely. And it is fantastic. It is really, really good. And it's a great choice. It's a great choice to sort of highlight this. This was, as perhaps befitting what we're saying, this is the only Bernstein score that there isn't some trace of on Spotify. So it is on YouTube. So we'll put a link to this score on YouTube in our show notes. But yeah, it is the only one we couldn't put on the other playlist because it's not as well known. So it's good to draw attention to that. Absolutely, yeah, good stuff. So yeah, for my next choice, I've gone for maybe a bit of a compliment to Airplane in not a less known film, but maybe a film that people wouldn't necessarily associate with Bernstein immediately. So National Lampoon's Animal House, the John Landis film from 1978, which is, I love that film. It's a great comedy. It's, a classic sort of late 70s, just bawdy, National Lampoon-y kind of comedy. But I think it's brilliant. And it's got a lot of music in there that's sort of based a lot, because it's set in the 50s, so it's based a lot on sort of 50s rock and roll and rhythm and blues and that kind of thing. So there's, things like, particularly there's Twist and Shout, which is, a key part of the film is a big, when they do shout, and it's so there's a lot of that music, but there are actual themes in there from Bernstein, and it's quite funny because he'd known, as we've said, John Landis introduced the concert that we were at in 2017, and he was a family friend of Landis from when he was a child. So John Landis said, "Can you come and score this?" And he apparently had no idea what to make of this film. It's like understandable. This is like a man nearly 60 years old. He's like, "What the hell is this?" But again, Landis wanted, and this is before Airplane, bear in mind, but he wanted him to score the film as though it was a serious piece of music. So apparently he adapted the main theme, which is the Faber College theme, from the Academic Festival Overture by Brahms. So and he's since said that this was kind of the doorway that opened him up to comedies, and particularly Airplane. So in a way, even though Animal House doesn't have lots of Bernstein music, it was a theme I remembered because and you said it with the other one, pomposity is the order of the day for this, because it really does sort of have that, because the whole idea is that, John Vernon's dean on the campus is this pompous bastard, basically, and you've got all these characters like John Belushi just having food fights and all this kind of thing as a compliment. It's so good, and I think the music works really well in the small bits you get of it to sort of underscore that.
Can I just admit, I've never seen Animal House, so yeah, I know. So
get on it, mate.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to. Yeah, I thought I'd just let that sink in. We've each had those moments during this podcast.
Oh God, yeah.
It's like,
I've got loads.
Like, you haven't seen that? Yeah.
What?
I need to get on that because I really want to see Bernstein's score in context. I could only find that one theme online. I was surprised at how little I could find of Bernstein's score in this, but I think what it shows is that really this score was obviously the outlier in Bernstein's comedy career, wasn't it? It wasn't Airplane, because as you said, this came before Airplane. Yeah. And one must credit John Landis for recognising the ability to score comedy films seriously before Zucker and Abrams did it. So clearly John Landis's comedy musical instincts were very finely tuned at that point. I suppose there is something about watching something grotesque being played in a dead serious manner that it speaks to our own impulses. It's very hard to try and articulate what it is, but like if something is kind of outwardly placid in terms of the body language of the character, or if something is outwardly outrageous in terms of the body language of the characters, and yet the music strikes a sincere note, there's a kind of cognitive dissonance there that I think is just very funny. It kind of it's we're not hardwired to deal with that, are we? As a species, it does create humour. I mean, I did look up, because you mentioned Bernstein's adaptation of that there for Animal House. Apparently, when Bernstein came to score Trading Places for John Landis a few years later, Landis asked him to adapt The Marriage of Figaro from Mozart. So clearly the idea of adapting pre-existing classical pieces into a comedy score became a kind of a running trend with them.
Yeah, and this one's just yeah. Go and watch the film definitely, and let me know what you think, because I think it's not exactly the same as Airplane, but I think it's really going for a sense of self-importance that is itself comical. It's itself, when you put it next to like characters like John Vernon's Dean, who is fantastic. John Vernon is just one of the greatest character actors in American cinema, and he's brilliant as this Dean who hates the students with a passion, hates them, and he's just the most elitist kind of American education person ever. And yeah, it's just, I just love it. It just puts a big smile on my face when I think of this music and the film. So yeah, I had to throw that one in there. So your last one then is very different. This one is another film I haven't actually seen. This is from Todd Haynes, starring Julianne Moore, Dennis Quaid, Patricia Clarkson, and I'll leave it to you to explain this one, because I haven't seen it. I've heard of it, but it's a particularly beautiful Bernstein score. And actually, I think, is it his last, or it's got to be one of his last, because this was 2002.
It's his last score. Yeah, it was the last score that Bernstein ever did, and what a coda to go out on.
Yeah.
It's Far From Heaven. 2002 pastiche American period drama that apes the style of those very lush 1940s, 50s Hollywood melodramas that you got from the likes of Douglas Sirk. You think of the likes of All That Heaven Allows, for instance, which were done in kind of stagey theatrical manners, very, very bold primary colours in terms of the hairstyle of the actors, what the actors were wearing. Lots of focus on suburban discontent. This is what Douglas Sirk did, and this is what Todd Haynes is aping in Far From Heaven through the character of Julianne Moore. She plays a housewife who comes to realise that her husband, played by Dennis Quaid, is gay. At the same time, he's a closet homosexual because it's set in the 1950s. At the same time, she is attracted to her black gardener, played by Dennis Haysbert. So what Far From Heaven is a really, really good film. It's a very interesting film. It's both an experiment, a pastiche of an earlier genre of movie, yet it also works dramatically on its own terms, because what the film does as a film made in 2002 is it is able to more explicitly draw on the themes of homosexuality and racism than the original Douglas Sirk movies were able to do, because they were largely bound by like the Hollywood code that would limit portrayal of such things. So Far From Heaven can take advantage of that. And the choice of Bernstein as composer was inspired because outside of Jerry Goldsmith, there wouldn't have been a better person to do this, because Bernstein was writing these kinds of scores at the moment that Douglas Sirk was making the original melodramas. Bernstein was kind of coming of age as a composer in the 1950s at the point where the Hollywood melodrama reached its apex. So the idea of bringing Bernstein full circle back to a self-referential film about 1950s Hollywood was brilliant. That was a genius move on the part of Todd Haynes, because Bernstein was doing this. I mentioned the intimacy earlier of To Kill a Mockingbird. You think of scores like Desire Under the Elms as well. Bernstein could create a sense of warmth and kinship unlike few other composers could. And what Far From Heaven does. I mean, Far From Heaven is a shimmeringly gorgeous score, and it sums up the appeal of Bernstein's music so brilliantly. It is a chamber-sized orchestra. It is largely a score that is based around one theme. So by basing a score around one theme, you create that sense of emotional connection with an audience. You're not dressing things up in too convoluted a manner. That one theme cuts through the sexual tension and the racism and the anxiety of the story to craft that connection with the audience. But it's about the variations that theme goes through. Centrally, it's got a real air of kind of wistful melancholy to it. The idea that the 1950s housewife, played by Julianne Moore, is not able to express herself in the way that she wants, and the music through the strings and the brass gives real sadness. It gives that inner voice to her. It's also deconstructed and presented in a jazzy arrangement, as per the likes of The Man with the Golden Arm and The Sweet Smell of Success, as we mentioned earlier. It's a really just hypnotically beautiful score that proves very often, as was often the case with Bernstein, the smaller the orchestra, very often the better it was. And it's so beautiful, and I can't imagine a composer bowing out on a more profound, perfect note. And the stars literally did align for this. Bernstein knew exactly what Todd Haynes was doing. Bernstein was making his chops at the moment that the kinds of movies that Todd Haynes was aping were in Hollywood. So it's just perfect all round. He was Oscar nominated for this. He didn't win again. I believe that was Elliot Goldenthal with Frida that got it that year. Again, like with To Kill a Mockingbird, they should have given it to him. If only just to cap off one of the most extraordinary film music careers in Hollywood.
Yeah, I haven't heard the score to Frida. I mean, Goldenthal's a good composer, but you can't imagine it would have been better than this, really. I mean, it's hard to imagine. Have you heard that score in comparison?
Not for a long time, no. The film is very good. I believe Frida is one of Goldenthal's more accessible scores, because Goldenthal is known for quite experimental, dissonant, avant-garde music. But I think, ironically, he won the score for Frida, which I believe, given it was about Frida Kahlo, I think had a kind of a Mexican influence and a more melodic influence. Absolutely, the Oscar that year was Bernstein's to lose, and unfortunately lose it he did. But what a legacy of music he left behind.
And it would have been easy to end this discussion on Far From Heaven in a way, given it's his last score. But I thought we'd finish with another one of his classic rousing scores, one of his most famous, to sort of remember him by. So for my last one, I went for The Magnificent Seven from 1960. Again, John Sturges, like The Great Escape a few years later. Probably. I mean, this could be the most famous Western, or one of the most famous Westerns ever, really. Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen again, a whole host of, well-known names. A remake of Seven Samurai, the Kurosawa film from 1954, set in the Old West. 7 gunfighters protecting a small village in Mexico. And again, I think it's kind of one of those pieces of music that maybe it's not quite as recognisable everywhere as The Great Escape, but it's not far behind, I think, The Magnificent Seven. The theme itself, the score is terrific, and it really does tap into all of those sort of Western tropes and ideas in a different way to someone like Morricone would, as we talked about recently with the Dollars trilogy and things. But this, I think the main theme, again, is hugely recognisable, isn't it?
I'd say, along with Ennio Morricone's The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, this is probably the most famous Western score that's ever been composed. I think it's so identifiable, isn't it? It's so, like, bearing in mind that caveat about The Great Escape, it is so recognisable. And I think Bernstein's rhythmic intuition and capacity for melody comes to bear on this score. There is a reason why this theme is so famous. It's because it's so brilliant. It melodically, harmonically, rhythmically resonates with a mass audience. It communicates the emotional narrative of the characters so brilliantly that it's little wonder that it's transcended the relatively niche label of film music, and it's found a wider appreciation than that. I think for me, having listened to the score again in its entirety, it's one of those classic things whereby the main theme is so famous that people tend to only focus on that. And there is so much more going on in the score. You have the percussive theme for Eli Wallach's villain character, the Calvera, which is, the percussion work in the score. I listened to this again and I was really struck by the sort of thunderous, violent, tribal nature of the music for Wallach's character and his gang of bandits. There's a real air of impending violence and catastrophe with it, which that's offset against the joyous rambunctiousness of the main theme, which, the main theme, appropriate enough, conjures up people on horses charging across the landscape. It does that through the rhythms, through the melodies. There is also, as I've mentioned repeatedly throughout this episode on Bernstein, he knows when to dial it back and to craft a sense of intimacy, because there is another theme for the Mexican village itself, which is beautiful. That doesn't get any kind of exposure next to the main theme, with the emphasis on the acoustic guitar, which is lovely. I mean, it's important that there is a theme for that, because that is what the characters are fighting for. That deserves its own theme. The way that all of these ideas circulate around each other in variously optimistic, propulsive, turbulent, angry, hopeful, melancholy tones is amazing. The score strikes such a huge amount of emotional registers, and it's not the score that I think people reduce it down to, which is, a lot of people tend to think of it as just an exuberant, bouncy, optimistic score. It's more complicated than that. It's more accomplished than that. And I think that there is a melancholy in it, as with scores like To Kill a Mockingbird. There is a sageness to it. There is a realization through the music that life being a gunslinger is a lonely, violent affair, and it will likely result in one's death. And the way that the score does build that real sense of sadness and empathy with the characters before, in the very last track, you are hit with the heroic stinger of the main theme, which sends you out on a high. But I think it's a score that it does give emotional voice to the loneliness of the characters as well as playing up their heroism. It's tremendous.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and I thought it's a good one to go out on, really, because I think, we've seen with a lot of these scores that Bernstein could do all kinds of varied different things, but I think he was particularly good at some of these sort of iconic themes and scores that really sort of set the template for certain particular genres of film in a way that, I wonder if nowadays, maybe because he's passed away quite a while ago, I wonder if he's as famous anymore as people like Jerry Goldsmith, John Williams, even like Bernard Herrmann, people like that. I do wonder this, because I don't hear him talked about quite as often, and I think it's surprising, because when you look at things like The Magnificent Seven, The Great Escape, To Kill a Mockingbird, they are still films that people watch, that are repeated, that are on television, but I don't always know if Bernstein is loved by people who love film music, and his themes are played and recognised in things, but is the man himself and his whole career quite as celebrated anymore as someone like some of the other people I've mentioned? Maybe he is. I don't know.
I think it goes back to that problem that I've just mentioned with The Magnificent Seven, is that people tend to think of it in terms of the themes, and the themes can often overshadow the person that created them, and they can also overshadow the broader nuances of a given score. And I think that hopefully what we've done here is we've shown that Elmer Bernstein was one of the most remarkably multifaceted composers in the history of Hollywood, in the history of music. I mean, we said this a few weeks ago about Ennio Morricone, the fact that some of Ennio Morricone's work is arguably as famous as Beethoven's Ninth. It reached out there, and I would put Bernstein up there with it. I mean, certainly you could put the theme for The Magnificent Seven up there with that, but it's important don't reduce the accomplishments of the man down to one theme that you've heard whistled at a football match or a Western theme that you've heard played on a bank holiday. There is so much more to appreciate than that. And I don't think that just happens with Bernstein. I mean, that happens a lot with John Williams. That would happen with the Star Wars theme. And it's a shame, but unfortunately, I think as a species, we're kind of wired to boil things down to their essence. And hopefully what we've done is we've in our own way set the balance straight on that. I mean, there is a quote. I want to return to that Ten Commandments review on moviemusicuk.us by Craig Leesey. This is a quote from Bernstein, which I think sums up the philosophy of his music. Of all the arts, I strongly feel that music is closest to religion. It is hard to explain what happens at the magical moment when suddenly there is music in my heart and mind, and I can go to the piano and express it in sound. That is why I feel that music, above all other arts, can come closest to expressing religious experience and conveying it to others. I mean, if that doesn't sum it up, I don't know what does. Beautifully eloquent words from Bernstein there.
Yeah, it's a great philosophy there, and you do feel that in a lot of what he's done. So it's been great to delve into the trove of some of his stuff. And obviously, you know, as you said earlier, we picked out just a few here, and he's got such a back catalogue to go and explore. So we'd encourage anyone to do that. Hopefully our playlist will be a starting point or a refresher if it's been a while for you to go back and listen to Bernstein. But absolutely go and do it, because there is some absolute gold in there. So yeah, it's been really fun, and this hopefully won't be the last time we do a deep dive into a classic composer who's no longer with us. I think we'll do that again at some point, and we're going to switch gears. I think for our next one, aren't we, Sean? We're going to do something a little bit more contemporary, I suppose, and I think we're going to talk about the best of 10 years ago, 2010. Yeah,
I can't quite believe that there have been a lot of anniversaries lately. I can't quite believe the likes of Toy Story and Inception and The Social Network are all now a decade old, and it's just kind of like, blimey. I don't,
crazy, isn't it?
I don't feel like I've got that decade under my belt, actually. I don't know about you, but it's just gone in the blink of an eye.
Really has, absolutely. So I dare say we'll get into talking about how old we feel and how time seems to be speeding up.
It's mostly going to be about how old we feel, isn't it? There's not going to be very much music.
No, not really. There'll be a bit of music talk and a little bit like, how old? Yeah. So yeah, look forward to that, guys. But there is actually some really good stuff in 2010 that we'll delve into. So that will be quite a fun little trip. And, you know, hopefully we'll be getting some new stuff coming through the pipe. All depends on the global situation, but we're enjoying these different types of episodes until then, so it's quite fun to do. So thank you for joining us for another episode, and remember, we're part of the We Made This podcast network, because the music of Elmer Bernstein is not the only thing we're talking about, so we'll give you a little taste of other shows on the network in a minute. But until then, we hope you enjoy the film music we've discussed, enjoy our playlist if you happen to listen to it, that you stay safe and well, and we'll see you next time as we discuss the music of film between the notes. Elsewhere on We Made This. Motion pictures.
Cinemas reopening here, and they have this list. It's like 450 films or something. You know, you're talking about The Empire Strikes Back, The Shining, or whatever. They've got a big list of what they're allowed to show. And there are some old films on there that are like pretty cringy today, like things like Breakfast at Tiffany's, where you have, I don't know if you've seen that film.
I haven't, no, actually.
Mickey Rooney plays Audrey Hepburn's like Japanese neighbour, and it's it's probably one of my least favourite performances ever.
Is this like Laurence Olivier playing the Sudanese like revolutionary in Khartoum in the 60s, where he was blacked off essentially?
It's terrible. It leans into all the stereotypes.
God. Right in the childhood.
So I've got lots of stuff like The Tripods, Dark Season, Brave Star, Nightmare, Robin of Sherwood, goodness knows what else that I'm going to be bringing to the table.
None of which I've actually heard of. That's not even. I was thinking I'd maybe, like when we came up with this idea, I thought, I'll know a few. None at all.
So, you know, these are things roughly from 1981 to 1995. Whereas, what are you bringing to the table?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm bringing Fairly Odd Parents, Power Rangers, Digimon, Drake and Josh, Recess and Lizzie McGuire for the first few, and then we'll get some more going.
I've heard of Power Rangers.
Yeah. So are you saying you've not heard of these either?
No.
We played this.
So what is it about the Final Fantasy, and especially Final Fantasy VII? What do you like about that series?
There's a lot that I like about the series. I love the system of materia and how you can actually raise that up instead of improving certain stats. Well, you can improve stats as well, but that's not really where the focus is. It's more about getting all of this magical energy up to its highest level, and then it has babies, and you have new ones, and that's so adorable.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. Between the Notes is produced and edited by Tony Black, who hosts alongside Sean Wilson. You can find Tony on Twitter at AJBlackWriter and Sean on Twitter at Seano22. You can find Between the Notes on Twitter at BTW_notes, on iTunes, your podcast app of choice, on Spotify, Stitcher, and on Spreaker, where the show is part of the We Made This podcast network. For more podcasts all about TV, film, books, music, and popular culture in general, you can find We Made This on Facebook and on Twitter at We Made This Pod. Thanks for listening.